Hello again, 201. In this video, I will complete Chapter 3 on the cultural, economic, and geopolitical topics of this region. There are persisting cultural homelands in Canada. The French-Canadian Quebec is an example of this. 23% of Canada is French, but 80% of the province of Quebec speaks French. And in 1976, bilingual education was established by law. And it's the key to preserving any cultural identity. If you don't speak the language, it's going to go away eventually. And television must present things in English and French. The Quebecois today feel the biggest threat to their French culture is from new immigrants from Southern Europe or Asia. They don't learn the language and they tend to place their children in English-speaking schools. Some other cultural homelands in North America are the Hispanic borderlands in the American Southwest, the Navajo Indian Reservation of Colorado, Acadiana in Louisiana, Cajun country down there. Ooh, yeah, we gotta go get some boudin. Where's my buddy Angelo? He loves that boudin. And we need to get some jambalaya going maybe too. And the Black Belt of the Mid-Atlantic and the Deep South are other cultural homelands in the United States. Relations between Canada and the United States have been peaceful since the end of the War of 1812. In 1959, the St. Lawrence Seaway opened the Great Lakes region to better global connections, and that was the end of the Erie Canal where I grew up because that's what they used to use. Now those Great Lakes vessels don't come down that far. They don't have to. They can get right into the St. Lawrence, and they don't go that far southeast into the Buffalo region because the Welland Canal is before the Erie Canal. Agreements have been reached on pollution and acid rain. As we mentioned in the earlier video, the North American Free Trade Act was expanded to Mexico after the Canadians and the Americans had already established their own. And there's been some minor conflicts over water resources, tainted beef, and the dumping of farm goods in recent times. Both Canada and the United States are federal states, which is the allocation of power between a national, state, and local level governments that all operate simultaneously and have levels and spheres of power. This decentralized system has been very successful in maintaining political stability. The United States is the second oldest government on the planet, only behind Great Britain. But it's also plagued economic change because it's difficult to get things done quickly. Change takes time in the United States because of this system, whereas centralized systems like China don't face these problems. Things are done from the top down. The U.S. Constitution came about after a Revolutionary War, whereas the Canadian Constitution was an act of the British Parliament. The national government in the U.S. has become more powerful over time because of the influence of the executive branch. It's become more presidentially oriented as opposed to being controlled by the Congress for most of our history. Since the 1930s, the executive has come to dominate, and with that, there's been more centralization. The federal government of Canada is very weak. The provinces maintain much autonomy, and this is how French culture, it's a reason why Quebec remained French. And they periodically threatened to secede. In 1980 and again in 1995, the Parti Québécois voted on secession, but it failed each time. And today, it's a minor party in provincial affairs. Globalization has had an impact on this region of the world. There's been a lot of European and Latin music has been more and more predominant in recent times. There's been increased consumption of foreign foods and beverages. And there is more and more bilingual education going on in North America, especially in places like California and Florida. Economics of the region. This is an abundant resource place. 335 million people of North America. It's 5% of the world's population, but they consume a great deal of the energy budget. But it also produces some of the world's most sought-after manufactured goods and services. There's North America has an abundance of natural resources in all of those different areas. And it's still an engine of the Canadian economy. They still have a large extraction economy going on. And the tar sands out in Alberta are only just beginning to be exploited. Agriculture it's one of the most efficient food producing systems in the world. It's highly mechanized, though. The old family farm has largely gone away. Commercial corporate farming is the way that it is done today, and only 1% of Americans and 2% of Canadians are directly employed in farming. And most of these farmers are older people. Large amounts of the United States are still classified as cropland despite urbanization and suburbanization. Canada has 7% cropland. Again, these are dated numbers now, but they're not too far off. And it has one of the most extensive forests in the world, and they are heavily involved in the timber, pulp, and newsprint businesses. The different agricultural regions of the United States. In the Northeast, there is a lot of dairy and truck farms that exist. By that I mean they have a lot of local markets that use the surrounding farmland, and then there is a central market where they sell their produce. The Midwest, my Uncle Dennis was a farmer of this type. He grew corn, soybeans, he had cattle for dairy, and he had hogs as well. And Dennis is retired now, and his farm is gone. The Northwest is wheat and other grains. The South, Mediterranean agriculture, viney vegetables or citrus is grown. And in the West, they have large-scale dairy, grape. The wine industry is heavy in California, and also fruits in California as well. They have a large orange and citrus business as well. Canada mirrors the United States in southern Ontario. There's large dairy operations in southern Ontario today. West of the 100th meridian, there are highly mechanized grain growing operations, and that includes Kansas, the Dakotas, northern Montana, Saskatchewan, eastern Washington, and Alberta. The U.S. is still importing about half of its oil, even though there are abundant resources in North America. We need to get back into the petroleum business. We're not allowed to export in the United States by law since the energy crisis of 1973. Those are the states and provinces. That's Alberta is a huge oil producing region of Canada, Alaska. The United States does not make much use of its coal. It has almost a third of the world's supply, and that declined during the 20th century because using coal is highly pollution. Air pollution results as a result of burning coal. And those are some of the other products that North America produces: lead, zinc, gold, silver, nickel. Connectivity has been largely done by the transportation boom. Europeans greatly reshaped the landscape, and they organized the economy forever under capitalist principles. North Americans were innovators in the 19th century, and they exploited the natural resources that were there. And that led to much urbanization, industrialization, and the commercialization of agriculture. Today, North America is more involved in service and information processing. In the late 1980s, Silicon Valley became the leading region of manufacturing exports of this particular information processing business because the education system, Stanford, Cal Berkeley, San Jose State, and these other universities led the way in these innovations. Geopolitically, the United States is a world military power. It has influence far beyond its borders. The industrial giant of the late 19th and 20th century became, after World War II, a world military power. The Monroe Doctrine was hemispheric in its intentions. Its doctrine said that 1, monarchy is a threat to the United States. 2, no further colonization will be permitted by the Europeans until the United States developed a deep water navy. That was largely backed by the British until about 1900. Afterwards, the United States had the ability to enforce that claim. 3, it's not going to interfere with any colonies where they existed. And 4, we're going to stay out of the affairs of the old world politically. Economically we'll be involved, but not politically. And that will be the case until NATO is formed after World War II. The Spanish-American War, or the War of 1898 as it's sometimes called, gave the United States imperial power. Philippines, Cuba became a protectorate, and Hawaii and Guam were annexed in that year, and they became naval bases and fueling stations. And between those years, the power was increased, and Caribbean and Central America largely resents the Norteamericanos for our influence in those regions because of the economics involved, and many American businesses are involved in those parts of the world. World War I saw increased American influence in European affairs, but the Treaty of Versailles was rejected, and America went back to its historic policy of isolationism, as said in the Monroe Doctrine. World War II forever changed the United States, and the Cold War, the ideological war between the United States and the Soviet Union, dominated world affairs. And the Truman Doctrine was formulated to try to stop the influence of Soviet Union and communism. We promised to aid any country resisting armed subjugation from without or within. It was basically an anti-communist doctrine. And the Marshall Plan was formulated to help rebuild the economies of post-war Western Europe. It was offered to the Eastern Europeans, but Joseph Stalin rejected this as Yankee imperialism. And unfortunately, they should have taken advantage of it because it was very, very successful for the Western Europeans in getting themselves back on their feet. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a collective security agreement between Europe and many other countries like Canada and Australia. A threat to one is a threat to all. And the Organization of American States was established to also try to counter communism. Those were the big Cold War conflicts that became hot for the United States. Eventually, the Cold War receded from dominating world affairs, but our reach continued to expand, mainly because of what Saddam did in Kuwait. We led a United Nations coalition opposing that aggression, and it was successful in getting the Iraqis out of that nation. And we've had a presence there since. It's not as great as it was 10 years ago, but we're still there. After we had been asked to leave Libya by Gaddafi, but now we are back in that part of the world, Southwest Asia, geographically speaking. And in the late 1990s, we led peacekeeping forces to prevent any further ethnic cleansing, as the euphemism, what was going on in the former Yugoslavia. The Serbians were conducting genocide against the Muslim populations in those areas. Today, there is still an arc of instability, as it was called in the Bush administration, and planners are refocusing on where U.S. interests need to be protected and how to distribute the 1.4 million. It's not that high anymore. It's gone down. The military personnel is not as high. That's a dated number. Many people object to the geopolitical aspirations of the United States. Jihadists, China, the Indian Congress Party, they see us as similar to the British or the Roman empires of history. The question for the United States going forward will be cost and the political tensions that it creates. Is the worldwide presence still necessary?